there are 42 people, 43 as we speak, and so it would be very, very helpful for all of the people who are in the audience to mute their mics so that we do not pick up any of your background noise. This is the whole new world of virtual events, and I would ask you to please mute your mic with the exception of Sheila and Jeremy for now, and when perhaps when we ask questions later and I recognize you, then you can unmute. Welcome everyone to this sort of wonderful book event, book launching of Sheila Jelen's Salvage Poetics. My name is Petrone. I'm a professor of Russian and Soviet history and the chair of history here at the University of Kentucky. I'll be serving as your moderator tonight. My first job is to introduce our panelists. First of all, I would like to introduce Sheila Jelen, who is an associate professor of Hebrew and Jewish studies in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages, Literatures, and Cultures here at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky. She's the author of Intimations of Difference, Devorah Barron in the Modern Hebrew Renaissance, and the co-editor of Modern Jewish Literatures, Intersections and Boundaries, and Reconstructing the Old Country, American Jewry in the Post-Holocaust Decades. The latter is by Wayne State University Press. But tonight we're here to discuss her brand new book, Salvage Poetics. I will serve as one of the discussants, asking Sheila some questions. The other discussant is my colleague in the Department of History at the University of Kentucky, Jeremy Popkin, who's the William T. Bryan Chair at the University of Kentucky. He has taught in the UK Jewish Studies program since its inception, and he is currently writing a biography of his grandmother, Zelda Popkin, who is a pioneering American Jewish novelist. So what I'd like to do now is to go ahead and turn things over to Jeremy, who will start us off with the first question.
Thank you, Karen. First of all, of course, I would like to congratulate our colleague Sheila Jelen on the publication of her book, Salvage Poetics. I realize that, whoops, I'm getting a feedback echo here. On the publication of her book, which clearly represents an enormous amount of scholarship and which has been very nicely published by the Wayne State University Press, even with color pictures in some places. I realize that many of you who are joining us won't have had a chance to actually see the book, but it's both a substantial contribution to scholarship and a lovely thing to hold in your hands, and I hope many of you will have that opportunity. Sheila, I thought the first question we might ask you is would you say a little bit about how you got interested in this project and how you shaped it the way you have?
Sure, Jeremy. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? We were having some trouble hearing me before. Am I coming in loud and clear?
Yes.
Yeah? You are. Okay. Okay, good. First of all, I want to thank everyone who is involved in the production of the book and also everyone who is involved in this very quickly organized book Zoom. I want to thank Christina Stonehill, Emily Nowak, Jamie Jones from the press who organized this and are somewhere in the audience tonight. I think I also saw Annie Martin, the editor-in-chief of the press. It's very nice to have you with us. I want to thank Karen and Jeremy, my new colleagues who feel already like my old colleagues because they are such wonderful friends and just really welcomed me so beautifully into the department at the University of Kentucky, or the program at the University of Kentucky of Jewish Studies. I also want to thank my students, my teachers, my colleagues, my family, and my friends who are joining us tonight. It's just so wonderful to have this group here with us. So to answer your first question, Jeremy, you said you wanted to hear a little bit about the background of the project, what brought me to this topic. So my first monograph was on the Hebrew woman writer, Devorah Baron, who was known for having written about the East European Jewish milieu of women and the marginal members of the East European religious community, Jewish community. She was writing during the modern Hebrew Renaissance at the turn of the 20th century, a period that coincided with the rise of Jewish nationalism and the birth of Zionism. As such, modern Hebrew literature was seen as a way to help build the foundation for an autonomous Jewish nation in Palestine. Hebrew, which had not been used as a spoken or vernacular language in several thousand years, was supposed to be part of the scripting of the possibility of a normalization of the Jews, a secularization and a liberation, as it were, from the difficulties of minority existence in majority Christian and also Muslim lands. The interesting catch, however, was how do you script a living Hebrew culture and literature with a language that is archaic, right? That doesn't have words for trains or toilets or certain types of foods or certain types of relationships, right? Dialogue was especially challenging to write. Anyone who participated in the modern Hebrew Renaissance was essentially reinventing the Hebrew language, imagining what a spoken vernacular modern Hebrew would look like in text as a way of staging it in real life. Devorah Baron was the only woman writer who became canonized within the generation of writers who were doing this experiment. It is fundamentally revolutionary and modernist because of the simple fact that Baron was trying to reinvent Hebrew. However, because she was a woman and because she wrote mostly about the East European shtetl instead of the new Jewish national homeland in Palestine, her work was viewed as quaint or idyllic and ethnographic, but not as radical or modernist. I was taught by my teachers in graduate school, one of whom is with us today, Naomi, I saw you pop in at the beginning, that for a work of literature to be viewed through an ethnographic lens was a kind of insult, right? A kind of blindness to the literary properties of the work. But in the course of writing my work on Baron, I reconsidered that claim. I found myself looking to Baron as a kind of resource on the worlds my East European grandmothers grew up in. They were both Holocaust survivors, and I heard bits and pieces about their lives when they were still alive, but I never got a comprehensive or non-traumatized picture of what their world was like before the war. I want to read just a few paragraphs from my book to sort of really explain how I got from Baron to this project. If you have my book, it's on pages 306 and 307. If not, I'll just try to read as clearly as possible. So I write in my postscript in the end of the book, and indeed what drew me to Baron in the first place, her stories gripped me because they told me about the women in the women's section, listening to sermons on a cold winter afternoon, about the cakes left to cool on the windowsill, and about the reaction of mothers-in-law to the birth of a daughter. Furthermore, my own grandmothers, Holocaust survivors born and raised in Eastern Europe, were not particularly forthcoming about their lives before the war. I felt in Baron's work that I had found an access point to my grandmother's lives. After writing a book arguing for Baron's unique contribution to Hebrew modernism in order, in part, to satisfy my teacher's need to reinstate her within the canon, I asked myself whether it would be possible to reclaim Baron's content as part of a broader phenomenon in modern Hebrew and Yiddish literature from the turn of the century that didn't exclude but transcended the discourse of nationalism that largely defines critical discussions of these literatures. To what extent, I asked myself, could Baron's style be understood the umbrella of salvage poetics, a poetic that marries literary concerns with ethnographic ones? So that's basically how I got to this project. I started thinking about how it's necessary to reclaim the ethnographic properties of a book and to not see it necessarily as a problem of reading, but as an intentional thing that modern writers may have been navigating as they tried to modernize Jewish culture at the turn of the 20th century.
Thank you. It seemed to me in reading the book that you were trying to walk perhaps a fine line between appreciating the efforts of these post-war authors and anthology compilers to keep alive some elements of the pre-Shoah European Jewish culture, and a desire, a sort of critique of many of them, such as the authors of the classic Life is with People, for romanticizing these small pre-war European Jewish communities. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
So, because everyone's not muted, I can't hear everything that's being asked. So if everyone could just make sure they're muted, because I think I need Jeremy to re-ask the question. There was a lot of noise in the background. Jeremy, would you mind asking it one more time?
Sure. I was asking you about the tension I sort of perceive between your desire to explicate the efforts of people like the authors of Life is with People to keep alive the memory of the pre-Shoah Jewish life in Eastern Europe, and a sense that they often fell into a kind of romanticism about this communal life. I wonder if you could kind of speak to that tension.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I had an early conversation with a colleague, Jeffrey Chandler, who teaches at Rutgers. He's a literature person who works a lot on ethnography as well. And his work has been really important to me in my journey into sort of a different discipline than I was trained to be in, right? I was really trained as a literary scholar. And when I started doing this project on the crossover between folk ethnographies and literature and images, I really needed as much help as I could get. And he was very instrumental in my conceptualizing this. And I was trained in a hermeneutics of skepticism, right? I was trained that anything you read, you challenge, right? You kind of work through it and see where the weakening points are and where the strong points are, and you try to, really critique it as you go along. And when I spoke to Jeffrey about some of my observations about how a lot of my teachers and a lot of the people whose articles I was reading when I was in training would call the literature of the Hebrew revival and also the literature, early, modern Yiddish literature as well, that was being written at the same time, that they would read them as quote unquote ethnographic. So one question that I had was, what does a literary scholar mean when they call something ethnographic, right? Why are literary scholars so attuned to this category? And when they call something ethnographic, what is it that they are identifying exactly? Are they identifying a lot of description? Are they identifying a certain kind of narrative voice? Or are they, as I mentioned earlier, simply saying, oh, if you're a Hebrew writer writing about Eastern Europe, then you must not be interested in style. You must just be interested in describing a world that's disappearing, right? So I was really interested in what literary scholars meant when they identified a text as ethnographic. And I was very critical and skeptical of that, right? And Jeffrey said, when you're doing an ethnography or you're thinking about ethnography, you're making observations and you're not critiquing so much. And so you have to find a way to navigate that path, right, in your own work. Because as a literary scholar, you're trained to critique and you're trained to be skeptical and you're trained to challenge. But as someone who is in part doing an ethnography of the ethnographies that came out in the early years after the war in the United States for American Jews who were interested in looking at what the world in Eastern Europe for Jews was like before the war, you have to be a little bit open to what was it that people were so eagerly reading? What was it that they were so eagerly believing, right? So when Life is with People came out, the book that you referred to, the subtitle is The Culture of the Shtetl, right? And really the whole idea of this kind of fictionalized, idealized, placeless, timeless shtetl that many Americans consider Eastern European Jewish life to be, right, came out of that book because it generated that image, right? It wasn't a real shtetl. It wasn't a real place. It doesn't have a real period of time that's associated with it. It's just this conglomerate of secondhand, third-hand observations of Americans who either immigrated or whose parents or whose grandparents immigrated, and as I argue in my book, who actually were reading Shalom Aleichem and Mendel Mocher Sfarim and Peretz. They were reading these classic Yiddish writers, whether it was in Yiddish or in translation by that point. And they were basing their understanding of the shtetl on literature, right? And I had to navigate two things, right? I had to navigate what in life is with Marx and Elizabeth
I'm
Benedict,
losing you.
a lab that was run by Margaret Mead. Sorry, Ruth Benedict. Sorry, not Elizabeth. Ruth Benedict. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, but it cuts in and out sometimes.
I don't know. Maybe you should.
It's one of those problems with Zoom. I don't think there's a quick cure for it.
Yeah, my students never tell me this, but I imagine they're not really listening to me anyway, so it doesn't really matter if they can hear me. You
Yeah,
can't
it's
hear
better.
me?
It's better now.
Okay.
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. So when Life is with People became a smash hit, right, and everyone was basing everything that they understood about East European Jewish life before the war on this one book, I was in the position to say, okay, on the one hand, it was a fact that this had a huge impact and everyone was responding to it. And on the other hand, where did it come from? How did they write it, right? What were people thinking when they were eager to believe that this was the sum total of that world, right?
Well, I think you.
So the whole book really is a kind of, yeah, go ahead.
I think you comment somewhere, of course, that the authors could not actually go into ethnography in these East European communities because, of course, they no longer existed.
Right. They were experimenting with a method called culture at a distance.
Yeah.
That was basically created in Columbia University during the Cold War for sort of the first century of anthropological studies. The ideal kind of anthropology was practiced in situ, right, in the place that you were studying. So anthropologists prided themselves on relocating to some island and eating the food of the locals and learning the language of the locals and then, describing the culture from inside. We had very close friends who spent time on an island in, it was called Ifaluk, and they ended up having quite an adventure, eating breadfruit, losing most of their body weight, getting pregnant. It was very complicated for them. But that was sort of the ideal for an anthropologist. But during the Cold War, people who wanted to study Soviet Russia, for example, couldn't get there, right? They couldn't go. So they created this new kind of anthropology called culture at a distance, and Life is with People was an experiment in this method, right? And the way they did it was basically they located informants in the United States who said, oh, I know about that world, and they would describe it. And it turned out that a lot of them were basically describing stories by Yiddish writers, right? And so that was really intriguing to me because I'm really interested at this intersection. I'm really interested in this intersection between literature and ethnography, right? And so they were using literature to populate this ethnography in this method of culture at a distance.
Yeah. I have to mention one of my first encounters with life is with people. My mother's parents had a copy, and when I was 13 years old and preparing for bar mitzvah, I asked my mother's father, who was the only one of my grandparents who had been born in Europe, if he would write down some memories of his childhood. And he wasn't very comfortable with writing, but he sent me some letters. And when I later read the book, it seemed to me that he must have consulted Life is with People and more or less copied certain passages from it in what he wrote to me. Another theme that you did mention a few minutes ago that's important in your book is this notion of a shift from text-based evocations of the shtetl to visual ones. Is this a reflection on the declining literacy of 20th century American Jewish audiences, or the fact that we live in an increasingly image-saturated culture, or how do you see the significance of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I see it as both, right? Mm-hmm. The shift that I traced throughout my book, and of course, while I was writing the book, I didn't notice this until sort of the end of my writing of the book, that I was tracing this trajectory, and I ended up sort of having to reshape the entire thing to follow it. But the shift that I trace throughout my book of American Jewish literacy from words to images has to do in part with the accessibility of Jewish languages to generations of Jews who had long been away from Eastern Europe, right? Mm-hmm. While the Yiddish press was still growing strong up until the 1950s, I think, it was read primarily by first-generation immigrants. Traditional Jewish education with an introduction to the sacred texts such as the Bible and the Talmud written in Hebrew and Aramaic fell away with subsequent generations of Jews. Even in the texts like the World of Shalom Aleichem, which is another major text that I study in the book by Maurice Samuels, that translate and gloss the original Yiddish stories of Shalom Aleichem for an American readership in order to facilitate their linguistic and their cultural understanding of the world represented in the stories, wasn't sufficient at a certain point for American Jews to really understand the culture he was trying to describe. With the help of photographs published by Roman Vishniak, which I describe in the 5th chapter of the book, these American Jews became more visually literate than textually literate, right? There was a corpus of images that began to come up again and again in publications and films and popular media that American Jews began to recognize and associate with East European Jewry. Works by Ben Shahn and Marc Chagall, Ilya Shor, and Alter Katzizna all became images that, even if you didn't know the names of the artists, right, begin to recognize these images. They pop up in movies, they pop up in books, in countless photograph albums that I also dedicated chapter 2 in my book. I think one of the most interesting examples of this dynamic is when I discuss the collaborative work of Meir Kirschenblatt and his daughter, the scholar Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett.
Yes.
So they wrote a book in the 90s, the late 90s, called They Called Me Meir July, which from the Yiddish, they called me Meir Tammuz, hottest month of the Jewish calendar. So they would call him Meir Tammuz because he was hot-headed, right? So Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett is a scholar of performance studies and anthropology at New York University, and she also, I think, is the director of the Jewish Museum in Warsaw. And when her father was pretty late in life, I think he was in his late 70s, early 80s, she encouraged him to start painting scenes from his childhood. He'd never done it before, but he was always very artistic, and he had just retired and he was getting depressed because he didn't have anything to do. So she encouraged him to paint his childhood. And she also interviewed him throughout the process about the paintings he was producing. And she would ask for elaboration and explanation when necessary. And so their collaborative book is a combination of his paintings and his voice describing the paintings and her prompting of him and expansions and elaborations based on their conversations. So this was the perfect book for an American Jewish audience, audiences, right? Because it combined image and text, but it also was multi-generational, right? You had a daughter and a father. So she Dafka, knows so much about East European Jewish life because she worked on it professionally for many years. And yet she's acknowledging that the best source is her father, who's a native informant, right? But they're also acknowledging that he has to basically describe it from a belated position, right? He has to describe it from the present, and that his paintings are paintings of the past. And so it's a laying out on the table of their different familiarities with the world that was destroyed, but also with the necessary distance from that world, even for the native informant. So just to go back to your original question, I think Americans are in a place where they're just more comfortable with images, but they've come back around perhaps to an interest in the language itself. I know people are studying Yiddish now, and there was a Broadway play, or a play in New York, a Yiddish fiddler that a lot of the people in the audience I know have seen, and I write a little bit about it in the introduction as an interesting development in salvage poetics, because it's no longer good enough to see Fiddler in English, right? People know Fiddler on the Roof so well as an artifact, it's in and of itself, that they can watch it in a language they don't really know because it feels more authentic in Yiddish, right? Even though they don't really know Yiddish, they know the play so well that the Yiddish feels like a comfortable frame, right?
With those American Broadway tunes, of course. My colleague Karen Petrone wants to come into the dialogue, but then I think we'll go to participants' questions.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I guess what I wanted to do to kind of, before we go to the participants' questions, what I wanted to do was bring it back to the question of, I think your work is really interesting and captures all these different dynamics about what Eastern Europe was supposed to be. But I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more about what this tells us about the American Jewish community in this time, that the salvaging happens in this particular way, in these, using these particular poetics, but also that the salvaging happens in this context.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that I really worked out once I moved to Lexington, Kentucky, I think, because I felt like a lot of the history that I was trying to teach myself about American Jewry was alive for me in Lexington, Kentucky, in the world that we inhabit here, because I grew up in a pretty enclosed Orthodox world in a major American city, Chicago. I never really understood when my students would talk to me about the things that were culturally Jewish as opposed to religiously Jewish, So I had a graduate student my very first semester at Maryland who was trying to explain to me that Dr. Brown's black cherry soda was Jewish. And I'd never even heard of it. I was like, Dr. Brown's what? And he couldn't believe I'd never heard of it. But I don't think I actually grew up in the same kind of world that, sorry, my dog is getting involved, that I grew up in the same kind of world that most American Jews did grow up in. So as I describe in my prologue to the book, post-war American Jewish life was a life that was working very hard to define Judaism in terms that would be familiar to an American Protestant way of life, right? So Leora Batnitsky, one of my daughter Malka's teachers, in her book, How Judaism Became a Religion, discusses what she calls, if I remember correctly, the Protestantization of American Judaism. And what does this mean? America is a fundamentally religious country. So to be a good upstanding citizen of America in the 1940s or the 1950s, you had to have a religious identity. But the religion that was practiced by Jews traditionally didn't fit into the American sense of what a religion should look like. It shouldn't be an all-consuming system that kept you separate from everyone else, which is to a large extent what traditional Judaism wants you to do, right? In last week's Torah portion, for example, we read about how Jews are supposed to be kadosh, which is generally translated as holy, but really means separate. because we're supposed to aspire to godliness, and God is distinctly separate from humans, right? However, without giving up their Jewish identity, because religion was an essential part of what it meant to be an upstanding American, American Jews had to change the way they practiced Judaism and viewed it so that it would not be alienating or different from what surrounded them. So I just want to read again just a few lines from my book, because I write it much better than I can say it, to be honest. Let me just find this passage. So I write in my prologue, declaring themselves members of a religion like other religions in America in the 1950s was the means that American Jews minimized their ethnic associations with the racial connotations that had proven to be such a barrier to the middle class for other ethnic minorities during the post-war era. In How Jews Became White Folks and What That Says About Race in America, Karen Brodkin has written extensively about the whitening of American Jews at mid-century because of the GI Bill, among other factors, and the role this whitening played in their rise into the middle class. Alongside this move to the suburbs was a boom in the building of suburban synagogues as a way for Jews to identify themselves as upstanding middle-class citizens within a predominantly religious American culture. So in a book that I co-edited with my colleague Eliana Adler at Penn State, which was also published through Wayne State, we discuss Philip Roth's famous short story, Eli the Fanatic, from his 1959 collection, Goodbye Columbus, which describes this very phenomenon. In it, if those of you who have read it can confirm whether I'm accurate. In it, Eli, a secular Jewish lawyer living in a secular Jewish enclave in a fictional town on the eastern seaboard, is confronted with the request by his fellow Jews to find a way to kick a boys' yeshiva out of town. Okay, they've recently, this is a group of survivor children and a survivor Rebbe and a survivor assistant. The year is 1948, the same year as the establishment of the State of Israel. They've bought a mansion in town and they've established an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva in this town where all these, you know, secular American Jews live and are trying to rise, you know, into the upper middle class. So Eli is hired to kick them out, to find a legal way to tell them they can't, that the neighborhood isn't zoned for a school, right? And they have to leave. And he becomes mortified by the lack of compassion that he's expected, you know, he's expected to kick them out, but they're survivors. And his wife is about to give birth. She kind of reminds me of the woman, but a lot of the chapters in my book, this identity that is betwixt and between. There's this kind of guilt and interest in the world that was destroyed, but there's also this anxiety about their own position in American culture and the need to.
On to you.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Sheila, I'm sorry, were you able to, I guess I'm wondering whether we should go ahead from there to questions. I thought you finished, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure you did.
No, that's okay. No, yeah. That's fine. That's a fine, yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So what I'd like to do, one thing that I would add, and you make this clear in the book, that's the same tension in some ways that the German Jews experienced in the, you know, sort of in earlier periods, right? That sort of tension about the Eastern European Jews making them not as assimilable, you know. So that is really interesting that it plays on both sides, right? It plays in the ideal imagined world beforehand, and also plays out in American. And you do make that point, but I find it the parallel very interesting. So from here, what I'd like to do is go ahead and open to questions. You can ask a question a couple of ways. One is by typing it into the chat. And if you do that, then I can read it out loud. Or if you just put your name in the chat, I can call on you and you can unmute and ask the question out loud. There's also a way to raise your hand, but if you know how to do that, please do. If you don't know how to raise your hand, just type your name in the chat and I'll call on you. Give a minute here to and let people have a chance to formulate questions. If not, okay. So there is a question from Naomi. I wonder if you're thinking about salvage poetics also provides insights into how people see orthodoxy today.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was thinking about this. Thank you, Naomi, for that question, by the way. I was thinking about how Hasidic stories play a role in my analysis throughout the book. So, for example, in my introduction, I talk about Buber's project in Western Europe early in the century of sort of editing, adapting, and collecting Hasidic stories as a way of helping secular Jews kind of relocate their spiritual sides or re-identify their own, religious past. I was using that as an example of salvage poetics because basically what are salvage poetics? They're a reframing of artifacts, right? A reframing of fiction or images that were created before the war that themselves are kind of half foot in, half foot out of tradition, right? 1 foot in, 1 foot out of tradition. So it's a reframing of those artifacts in a way that American Jews can better understand. So one of the artifacts that a lot of different people are reframing for this moment happens to be Hasidic stories. Hasidim are highly visible, right, in New York City neighborhoods and in business districts, and they have become now conflated with all of Orthodox Judaism from a very popular perspective, right? Encouraging secular Jews to embrace a kind of ethnic as opposed to a religious identity because the Hasidim seem so exotic and so foreign and so out of place that the perception is that all Orthodox Jews are like that, right? And so there's really nothing in between. And so this popular perception had a significant impact on the reception of what has been called neo-Hasidism or pseudo-Hasidic works, which attempted to capture the spirit of Hasidut, but translated into modern ethnic terms. So what's interesting, though, is that I think that the way that people see Orthodoxy today, which is kind of centered around the exotic chassid, is very much attributable, right, to this dynamic of wanting to sort of keep authentic Jews at a bit of an arm's distance. You know what I mean? Hasidim make that possible because they feel so foreign. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are some initial thoughts on that.
Thank you. We have a question from Francie Chasson Lopez. Francie, you can unmute and ask.
Whoops. Okay. Thank you so much, Sheila. This is really interesting. I had a question, coming from Latin American studies. One of the things is that literature is often considered regionalist and ethnographic. So that has become a put down. And I'm wondering if it also is a put down in your case.
Yeah, I started this evening by talking about how this project was born from a need to sort of recuperate a particular woman writer who was called ethnographic as a way of putting her down, right? And I think that's absolutely true. And I think ethnography also has gotten a bad rap because it's considered colonialist, right? You go in
right.
and you study the native and you write about the native and then you go away and you become famous at the expense of the native, right? And so when I first started this project at Maryland, I was excuse me, I was directing a comparative literature program, and I suddenly had carte blanche to like do whatever kind of programming I wanted. And for several years, I organized seminars and discussions among graduate students and also faculty about ethnography and literature. And a lot of the faculty was very hesitant because it's so out of fashion, right? I mean, you don't want to be associated with ethnography as a literature person because it's
But
so
now
colonial.
it's coming back. Now it's recuperated.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there are ways to do it responsibly. And what I've been trying to do in this book is really not practice ethnography so much as I'm trying to understand the interest in ethnography from a scholarly perspective when you're looking at this particular body of literature, but also the kind of folk ethnographies that grew out of this literature, right? Where Americans would read Life is with People or see Fiddler on the Roof. Even Americans who know that Fiddler on the Roof isn't the real thing are hesitant to acknowledge that, you know? Like, so for example, my father, who's in the audience, sort of fancies himself a kind of Tevye, you know what I mean? Even though he's basically from Eastern Europe himself, he knows better than that, right? But the point is, it's such a powerful cultural force, right? And Americans want to believe that it's a description of a culture. So,
well,
so
it was a big hit in Mexico City also. I saw it in Spanish.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions, but let me go ahead and give them one at a time here. From Rachel Jablon, do you see an overlap of salvage poetics and heritage tourism? And it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. That's a wonderful question. Rachel did a wonderful dissertation on how people create Jewish communities in the post-Holocaust era on the internet. So she's a real expert in this. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's this sense in heritage tourism that you can actually see something authentic when it goes back to the lieu de mémoire, right? This idea of, you know, places of memory, that somehow a geographic location is, it holds the authentic history of a family or of a nation, right? And so this search for an anecdote or an authentic artifact, right, that can help one sort of connect with one's past is, I think, very much an overlap between salvage poetics and heritage tourism, that somehow reading Shalom Aleichem in Yiddish can give you something that you can't get by reading it in English, or going to your family's, you know, to Sosnovich or whatever can give you something that you wouldn't get otherwise. I think there's definitely an overlap.
Thank you. We have a question from Liang. I love how you convincingly argued that literary culture plays a monumental role in the invention of ethnicity. Can you elaborate further on how you see the role of the literary and the ethnographic in shaping our understanding of history and identity, especially for minority communities in the United States today?
Thank you, Liang. That's a great question. I'm just looking at the question to formulate an answer.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate further on how you see the role? Yeah, so basically, I can just speak for myself. You know, I'm a literature person, and I have always learned through literature. You know, I never went first to a history book. I never went anywhere else other than to novels or poetry to learn about the things that mattered to me and that I identified with. So for example, a few weeks ago, during Passover, I led a Torah study group on the Song of Songs and for my synagogue on Zoom. And while I was preparing for that, I remembered suddenly this wonderful little novella written by Shalom Aleichem called The Song of Songs, which is a love story between a boy and a girl who grew up as brother and sister, but are actually uncle and aunt. So they're about the same age, but the boy is the uncle, and not uncle and aunt, uncle and niece. The boy is the uncle and the girl is the niece, and they grow up in the same house because the girl's parents have left her. And so as I was bringing together this Shalom Aleichem story with the original Song of Songs, it also occurred to me that one of the most famous Yiddish films in history, which is called The Dybbuk, which is basically a story about spiritual possession, which was made in 1937 in Poland, has this incredibly long sequence of these scholars, these boys, these yeshiva young men singing the Song of Songs to one another in this kind of homoerotic scenario. And I also showed that clip. And I realized that what I'm doing in Lexington, Kentucky, by bringing together these three texts, Shalom Aleichem, the Dybbuk, and the original biblical text, is I am giving a piece of a culture. And it's not just descriptive, it's why was the Song of Songs such an important intertext for everything, you know? Like, why did this Yiddish film need to elaborate on this book from the canon, the biblical canon? Why did Shalom Aleichem, the famous Yiddish writer, feel the need to rewrite this book in, you know, in terms of, you know, a modern frustrated love story? So I think that on two levels, it shapes our understanding of history and identity. One, in terms of content, but also in terms of intertextuality, in terms of what are these people reading and what keeps coming up again and again and again in the stories they tell about themselves. What literature keeps coming back. And in that instance, it was the Song of Songs. So it was an interesting moment when I realized what I was doing.
Thank you. Sheila, there's, let's see, one more question here. I'll also, I'm assuming you can read it too, but I'll read it out loud. This is from Henry. Before the war, many of the immigrants wanted to forget their life in Europe, and they were also scared of themselves. They were scared for themselves because of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. And now we're talking about wanting to remember the pre-war life.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's from my father. Thanks, Dad. So I guess what you're asking is, why would, you know, in your experience, people didn't want to remember, they wanted to forget, right? And so why would they suddenly want to be remembering, right? So that's a complicated question. I mean, I think the Holocaust kind of changed everything, right? I think after the Holocaust, people started feeling like they were far enough away from that world, it had been sufficiently destroyed, right? That there was suddenly this kind of nostalgia. I spent a lot of time when I was researching this at the archives in New York, the YIVO archives, looking at photographs in the Sunday section, the Sunday art section of the Vorwärts, the Yiddish newspaper. And there were these, I discussed it in my book a little bit, but there were these beautiful rotogravure photographic collages that were of Jews in Eastern Europe, that people in America in the 1920s and in the 1930s in the Yiddish press were reading. And in the book, Image Before My Eyes, which was edited by Lucian Dobrzycki and Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett in 1977, it's a photographic history of Poland from the YIVO archives. Barbara, she conjectures that one of the reasons people were so interested in this section of the Vorwärts was because it reinforced the justification for their leaving Europe, right? There were mainly pictures of poverty, of manual labor, of scholarship, of piety, of hunger, right? And so looking at these pictures made people, it simultaneously made them nostalgic for authentic Judaism, but it also reinforced the wisdom of leaving, right? And I think that and those pictures are actually some of the pictures that I analyze in my book, because they are published in post-Holocaust collections, right? And so it's interesting to think about how different perceptions were applied to the very same pictures before the war and after the war. So after the war, there was more nostalgia. Before the war, it was more like, oh, that's really interesting. I'm glad I'm not there, you know?
Thank you, Sheila. So Hannah Smith has a question.
Actually, I have a question.
Okay.
When you started off with discussing, trying to resurrect the writings of Miss Barone, she wrote in Hebrew. Whom did she want to write to? And did she succeed? And have you succeeded in getting her to people to start reading what she'd written?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just me. You know, I was taught about her in graduate school. My teachers, Hannah Kronfeld and Naomi Seidman, did a translation of her work before I started working on her that really made her accessible in English. You know, all the Hebrew writers, as I was saying earlier, they were basically writing for ideological reasons, right? There was, Don Miron calls it a republic of writers, right? They were basically writing for each other. There were very few people who had the skills to read a Hebrew novel. Like, there were a lot of people who could read Torah, right? Or who could read Talmud. But what they were doing was they were reinventing the Hebrew language. And and my other teacher, Robert Alter, in one of his essays on the invention of Hebrew prose, calls it a prehensile ability in the Hebrew language, right? You had to be like a superstar to be able to write in Hebrew, because they were deliberately taught to not understand. They were not taught Hebrew grammar, right? They were not taught to use it in this context. They were deliberately kept from learning Hebrew properly because they didn't want the Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language, to be used for secular purposes and for, you know, fiction or whatever. So she was writing for herself and her friends, and but I think she's read now. I mean, I think that certainly she's read in Israel. And I think that people are very interested in her, in part because she was a woman, but also in part because of her writing about Eastern Europe in Hebrew at a time when most people were not writing about Eastern Europe in Hebrew because it didn't fit into the nationalist ideology, right? But yeah, I mean, there are some good translations of her that Naomi and Hannah have done. And I did a few translations in my book, my earlier book. And then there's another translation called The Thorny Path. I don't remember the name of the translator, but I also found that very helpful and very accessible.
Thank you. So there's one more question here. When you use the term Hasidim, does this apply generally, melding the different sects, regional heritage together? Do the different sects and regional heritage together, or to a specific sect?
Right. So yeah, I mean, there are different sects of Hasidim, right? So there's Satmar Hasidim, and there's Lubavitch Hasidim, and there's Bobover, and there's Bratzlover, and, you know, so usually when people say Hasidim, they're referring to the whole thing. But the point I was trying to make earlier was that, you know, I do this experiment sometimes in my classes. I don't do it now because really no one here really is equipped to even answer this question at all. But in Maryland, I would say, you know, what do you see here? And I would pick up a picture of an Orthodox Jew and I said, oh, I see a chassid. So basically, chassidim are conflated with all religious Jews now. They become so visible and so, you know, but Hasidim do not equal Orthodox Jews. They are their own thing.
Thank you. So I am given another minute for a last question. Oh, okay, here we go. We have a question from Eva Zelig. What do you mean by the whitening of American Jews?
Good question, Eva. Thank you for coming. Eva, I'm so happy to have you here. So basically, you know, when I fill out demographic surveys, I'm always very uncomfortable just writing white, because like 50 years ago, Jews weren't considered white. Jews were considered Jews, and we were considered racially different than, you know, regular Americans. And, you know, a lot has been written about the relationship between the Black community and the Jewish community. A lot of different people have written about that and thought about that. But one of the theses that has really stuck with me is that Jews became white sort of by emphasizing how they could pass as white in a way that Blacks could not, right? Philip Roth has written about this. But at a certain point, you know, Jews could start sort of assimilating ethnically, racially, in a way that Black people simply could not. And they started benefiting from that chameleon-like ability, right? We could move into neighborhoods that Black people couldn't move into, even though there were some neighborhoods that Jews still couldn't move into because Jews were still not considered white enough, right? So as I mentioned earlier, Karen Brodkin wrote a very interesting, she's a sociologist, and she wrote a very interesting book called How Jews Became White Folks and what that says about race in America. And I first discovered that book when I was teaching The Human Stain by Philip Roth, in which a Black man passes as a Jew. And so he doesn't pass as white, but he passes as a Jew, because the Jew is kind of this intermediate stage between Black and white during the years that this story is taking place, right? So there's a kind of staging of that process. And it sort of began in the post-war period that Jews sort of started moving into the white category. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. Okay, going once, going twice. If anybody wants to ask a question, now is the moment. Okay, hearing none, I would like to thank everybody. This is a wonderful turnout. I'm delighted that you've all come and to hear Sheila's book. I want to thank. Maybe we can give Sheila a hand for this excellent book that she and it's really fascinating. And as you can see, there's so many different themes that it plays to, and so many different questions that it answers. And so, it's really resonant in many different directions. And I'm sure that we could, have another whole set of questions and, take this in another 10 different ways. In fact, we didn't even ask all the questions that we had. And so I want to congratulate Sheila again on this wonderful work. I want to thank everybody for coming. And I want to remind everybody that if you can notice in the chat that if you go to the link and you use the word, oh wait, here we go. Yeah, and you can order Salvage Poetics at 40% off with the coupon READ, and the link is there in the chat, but it's also at Wayne State Press. And thank you very much to Jeremy for participating, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity. Oh, I have one more message I need to. Oh, there we go. There's the last message is the link again.
Okay.
Sheila, congratulations. Wonderful seeing you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. That was fabulous.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you to everyone for coming, and especially thank you to Karen for moderating, and for Jeremy as well for asking such excellent questions, and for students coming all the way from Ukraine and to participate. I saw you, Natalia, popping in. So thank you again to everyone for being here and for supporting me through this process.
Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you.
And Emily and Karen and Jamie. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Great session.
Okay.
Thank you. It was wonderful. And Joe and I.
Nice to see Malka too.
We're fabulous.
All right. And now off to the champagne reception, right?
Oh yeah. Family dinner.
I gotta go make dinner now. It's almost dinner time.
Sure.
Everybody.
I think we need a glazed salad.
Jelen and him a whole family.
Thank you all for coming.
Good to
All
see
right.
you all.
All right.
And Cannon, Libni, Anna, good to see you again.
Hello. Oh no, that didn't mean me.
Hi, Marilyn.
Hi,
Here's
Angela.
Stephen.
Baba.
Hi, Uncle Bill. Bye,
Just a
Uncle
moment,
Bill.
let me look for you. Hi, Amy.
No.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Liliana.
This is
Okay.
Okay, well, I just thought that
Ladies.
was supposed to lead to
I
that.
don't know how to chat.
Take care.